A river bend could decide an empire's destiny. Medieval trade was a brutal lottery. The grand prizes were cities of unimaginable wealth. I want to look at the hidden rules of that game. Why certain cities became trade giants, why others vanished completely. It gives you a lens for understanding the past and for seeing the rise and fall of modern economic hubs. A city built on water like Venice, how did it come to control entire seas, and what fatal flaw caused mighty trading centers to be abandoned? We're looking at the economic logic of a world where geography was fate and human ambition was the ultimate currency, the most fragile ingredient in a city's recipe for success. What do you think that is? Geography cast the first vote, and it was the most important one. You have to see the land not as a backdrop, but as a participant. It offered a set of possibilities. A menu, and the cities that succeeded were built where that menu was longest. A merchant caravan crossing a desert for months didn't just find a trade hub. It was pulled toward one by the logic of rivers, by coastlines, mountain passes. This was geographic luck, the raw, unchanging reason a settlement could begin. Where two great rivers met like Novgorod, that became a natural exchange. Northern furs, southern spices, or a settlement on a narrow strait like Constantinople. It could control all traffic between two seas, wealth just for being in the way. These places were funnels, commerce had to pass through. The cost of moving goods back then was staggering. Every extra mile on a muddy road, every extra day at sea, that meant more bandits, more storms, spoilage. So a city that shortened a journey or offered the only safe harbor, it wasn't about convenience. It was about survival. Take Bruges, in what's now Belgium. It didn't have a deep natural port. Its advantage was being the furthest point inland that seagoing ships could reach. Through rivers and canals that made it the perfect terminus, ships from all over would unload there, and from Bruges, goods went inland by barge and wagon. It became Northern Europe's central warehouse, not by accident, because geography made it the most efficient place for that exchange to happen. The land whispered where to build. But here's the thing, from historians like Braudel, geography sets the stage. It writes the first draft. It presents the limits, the possibilities. A perfect harbor means nothing if no one uses it. A strategic river crossing holds no power if it isn't fortified. Geographic luck was just a ticket to the game. What people did with that luck determined everything. A fortunate location was an invitation, a potential. The question is which cities accepted it, and how did they turn a lucky bend in a river into a trade empire? That transformation required a second ingredient, more volatile, human ambition, channeled through raw political power. The second vote was political power. And it could change what geography allowed. Think about a merchant at a crossroads looking at two cities. Both have good rivers, both have decent ports. But one is run by a local lord who changes taxes whenever he wants. He might take goods he likes. He could throw a trader in jail over nothing. The other city has a royal charter. It promises fixed tolls. It says your property is safe. Your contracts will be honored in a standard court. The choice was obvious. It was the difference between making a fortune and losing everything. A perfect harbor didn't matter if the ruler on the shore was a predator. Stable, predictable governance created something invisible. It created trust. Long-distance trade isn't just one-time deals. It's a web of relationships that lasts for years. A merchant in Alexandria needed to know the pepper he ordered from Calicut would arrive. He needed to know the silver he sent would be accepted. That trust couldn't grow in chaos. It needed the shelter of reliable laws. We have the words from that time. The charters of the Hanseatic League, that network of trading cities, they didn't just talk about goods, they promised safety. They outlined legal procedures for disputes. They created a common standard, a known set of rules across hundreds of miles. That was the operating system for medieval commerce. So how did cities get this stability? Often they bought it. A king, always short of cash, would grant a wealthy town a charter. In exchange for a large sum of gold, the town got autonomy. Self-government, the right to mint its own coins, the authority to hold annual fairs free from the meddling of local lords. These charters were a city's declaration of economic independence. They let places like Lübeck become islands of commercial law in a sea of feudal obligation. And then there were the powerful patrons, a king, a pope, an emperor. They didn't just make rules, they built the stage, they funded the quays where ships unloaded, they built the warehouses for spices, they used their diplomacy to secure trade treaties, to open foreign markets. Look at Constantinople under the Byzantine emperors. Trade wasn't left to chance, it was a state-managed enterprise. The emperor controlled the silk industry. He set the tariffs. He made sure the city's markets were the only place to buy certain luxury goods. That centralized control created immense, reliable wealth. But there was another model. In the north, the Hanseatic League showed a different path. No single emperor ruled it. It was a decentralized alliance of cities from Novgorod to London, bound by mutual interest and common laws. They cooperated to protect their merchants, to negotiate as a bloc, to wage economic war against princes who threatened them. It was stability through cooperation, not command. And political rivalry itself could drive innovation. Look at Genoa and Venice. Their hatred for each other was legendary. That fierce competition didn't stifle trade. It supercharged it. It drove them to build faster ships, to fund more daring explorers, to colonize more aggressively, taking strategic islands and forts across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Their political conflict became an engine for commercial expansion. It makes you think, how does political stability influence where you invest or do business today? You're drawn to places with clear rules, where contracts are enforced, where you don't fear sudden, arbitrary change. The medieval merchant felt the same pull. But here's the brutal truth of that era. Even the fairest laws, the most enlightened charter, the most powerful patron, they were just words on parchment if the city couldn't do one final, fundamental thing. A city with wealth but no walls, that's just a bank vault with no door. So military power became the third vote, the deciding one. It wasn't about conquest, not for its own sake. It was about creating a bubble, a zone of safety in a world that was mostly danger. The walls of Carcassonne, the cannons on a Venetian galley, they sent a message. More powerful than any charter, your capital, your goods, your life, they're secure here, inside our reach, and that security, that's what made commerce possible. Real commerce on a scale that mattered. The historian John Keegan put it that the castle and the market town were two sides of the same coin. One couldn't exist without the other. A busy port needed a fortress overlooking it. A trading fair needed soldiers to patrol its edges. The threat was always there, pirates at sea, rival lords on land. One successful raid could wipe out everything. A generation of accumulated wealth gone. So cities invested heavily in their own survival. They financed massive walls so thick they could withstand a siege for months. They dug moats, they built watchtowers for early warning, but stone was only part of it. They also invested in people. Some used citizen militias, every merchant, every craftsman, training to defend the walls. Others hired professionals, a paid garrison, soldiers whose only job was protection. The cost was enormous, maintaining that army, repairing fortifications, building warships. It consumed a huge part of a city's revenue. But the alternative was far more expensive. The cost of being sacked, your markets burned, your warehouses looted, your population gone. It was a brutal calculation. And every successful city made the same choice. You pay for the shield, the most direct link between military power and commerce was controlling the routes themselves. If you held a fortress on a major road or river, you could charge tolls. Every merchant passing through paid. More importantly, you could deny that passage to your rivals. This was economic warfare, waged with castles. Look at the maritime empires. For Venice and Genoa, their fleets were the ultimate hybrid tool. A Venetian galley was a masterpiece of dual purpose. In peacetime, it was a cargo ship carrying silk and spices from Alexandria. In wartime, that same vessel, the same crew, became a warship. Rowers became marines. The cargo hold cleared for artillery, so their commercial lifelines were also their battle lines. They didn't just transport goods, they policed the sea lanes. Escorting convoys, hunting pirates, their naval power created a protected highway right across the Mediterranean. Inland cities took a different approach. A place like Nuremberg, deep in Europe, had no navy. Its security came from geography and masonry. It sat at a crossroads, major overland routes, and it was encircled by a legendary ring wall with towering gates. That wall was its economic engine. It told merchants from Italy, from Flanders, that once your goods pass through these gates, you're in a zone of absolute security. The city's wealth funded the walls, and the walls protected the wealth, a perfect self-reinforcing loop. Sometimes security came from an organization. A specialized one. In the Baltic, the Teutonic Knights played this role. A military order, they conquered territory, secured it, built a network of fortified castles. In exchange for that security, they exerted immense control over trade. Amber, grain, timber. They didn't just protect merchants, they became the ultimate middlemen, governing the whole commercial ecosystem from behind their walls. Even a barren rock could become a trade hub with enough military engineering. The island of Rhodes is the example. For centuries, it was a minor stop. Then the Knights Hospitaller took control, another military order. They turned it into the most fortified place in the Mediterranean. Immense walls capable of withstanding the latest siege artillery. And suddenly, this rocky island became the safest port between Europe and the Levant. Merchants flocked there, knowing their ships, their cargo, were protected by the most formidable knights of the era. Rhodes became wealthy, not despite its focus on defense, but because of it. It makes you think, what are the modern equivalents of those walls? Today's economic hubs rely on digital security, stable financial systems, reliable legal enforcement. Those are the invisible fortifications now. They make global trade possible, the new moats and battlements, protecting not from raiding armies but from cyber attacks, from financial fraud. The principle is unchanged. Security provides the stage, but the actors on that stage, they were the merchants, the bankers, the families who wove the actual web of trade across continents. A walled city with safe routes, that's just the stage, empty. The real performance, the movement of goods and gold, needed specialists. That's where the merchant guilds came in. They weren't social clubs, they were the operating system for trade. In a hall smelling of wax and wine, a merchant from Genoa could hand a piece of parchment to a banker from Bruges. That simple act, a bill of exchange, meant wool sold in England could pay for silks bought in Constantinople. No heavy coins ever had to cross the Alps. That was financial alchemy, invented out of necessity. Guilds did more than broker deals. They built a framework of trust where there wasn't one. In a world without international law, a guild enforced its own. It set standards. A pound of pepper in a Hanseatic warehouse had to be exactly that, a true pound of pure pepper. Anyone caught diluting spices or using false weights was fined, banned, or worse. That reliability was their brand. It meant a buyer in Novgorod could order Flemish cloth sight unseen, confident it was the exact quality promised. The guild also trained the next generation. Rigorous apprenticeships passed down skills and trade secrets. They provided a safety net, too. If a member's ship was lost, the guild would support his family. That mutual aid reduced the fear of total ruin. It encouraged more daring voyages. The financial innovations were something else. Take the Commenda contract. A wealthy investor in Venice, a widow, a retired merchant, would provide capital to a younger trader sailing to Alexandria. The trader contributed his labor and courage. When he returned, the profits were split. The investor earned a return without facing pirates or storms. The sailor got access to funds he could never raise alone. That simple agreement pooled capital and spread risk. It fueled trade's expansion. Then you had the banking families of Florence, like the Medici. They didn't just lend money. They built an information network. Their agents in London, Lyon, Naples sent constant reports on politics, harvests, market prices. That intelligence was more valuable than gold. It let them move money where it was needed most, to anticipate shortages and gluts. They issued letters of credit. A merchant could travel across Europe without carrying a fortune. He'd just present a letter to another Medici agent to receive funds. They financed kings and popes. They wove political power directly into their financial web. The Hanseatic League perfected a different model. Their contours, like the ones in London or Novgorod, were fortified trading compounds abroad, bubbles of Hanseatic law on foreign soil. Inside, disputes were settled by Hanseatic judges. Goods were stored in Hanseatic warehouses. That created a predictable, familiar environment for their merchants thousands of miles from home. A huge competitive advantage. Even temporary markets could etch prosperity into the land for centuries. The Champagne fairs, for a few weeks each year, fields in northern France turned into a bustling international market. A cycle of 6 fairs governed by strict guild rules and special courts for quick justice. It created a neutral ground. Flemish cloth met Italian silks. German metals met Eastern spices. The Counts of Champagne provided security and protection, taking a cut of the wealth. For 200 years, that temporary, regulated space was the commercial crossroads of Europe. It shows how human institutions could make a place important without a permanent port or fortress. So you have geography, politics, military power, and now these financial and guild structures. Each layer builds the ecosystem, but all this complexity, all these contracts and caravans, they converged on one final, physical point: the marketplace itself. A marketplace wasn't just an open square, it was a machine, a complex one, and the cities that did well, they built the best parts for it. That was the 5th factor: specialized infrastructure for commerce. You had the quays at Lübeck, but these weren't just docks. They had these big wooden cranes towering over the water, unloading whole holds of timber. Barrels of herring, and nearby long warehouses. Some were even heated to protect things like wax or cloth. This wasn't just convenience, it was the city's argument. Its physical argument for your business. By investing in this apparatus, a city lowered what they call transaction costs. The time, the labor, the risk of moving things. A deep, dredged port meant a large ship could unload right there. Instead of ferrying everything to shore on small boats, a covered market hall meant you could seal a deal for English wool even in a rainstorm. The infrastructure sent a signal: we are serious about your commerce. We built a system to handle it efficiently, safely, at scale. It often started simple. A muddy riverbank where fishermen pulled up boats, that might get a few wooden pilings. Then, as trade grew, those became a proper wharf, then a stone quay. Then a whole system of quays, each for a different type of good. The city became the investor, funding these projects because the return was more merchants. More tolls, more wealth. Bridge building was a supreme act of infrastructure with immense economic power. London Bridge, with houses and shops built right on it, didn't just cross the Thames. It controlled it. Every vessel passing through its narrow arches paid a toll. It became a street, a marketplace, a customs house, all in one, funneling the lifeblood of trade right into the city's heart. For the traveling merchant, infrastructure meant survival. After a long journey, cities built public inns, hostels often organized by merchant nations. The German merchants had their own hall in Venice. The Venetian merchants had theirs in Alexandria. These were more than hotels, they were secure compounds. With storage, stables, chapels, a familiar refuge in a foreign land, they reduced the fear, the uncertainty that could paralyze trade. On the water, safety was infrastructure. Lighthouses like the famous one at Genoa guided ships through treacherous night approaches. Harbor moles, those great stone arms extending into the sea, created calm anchorages. Sheltered places where ships could wait out a storm without being dashed on the rocks. Each feature made a port more reliable, more attractive, and so more wealthy. The ultimate expression was the Venetian arsenal, a state-owned industrial complex, a walled city within a city, dedicated solely to shipbuilding. Through standardized parts and an assembly line processed centuries before the term was coined, the arsenal could produce a fully equipped war galley in a single day. This wasn't just about building ships, it was about projecting power, ensuring commercial dominance. The Venetian fleet, the backbone of its trade empire, could be repaired. Replenished, expanded with terrifying speed, infrastructure became an instrument of strategy, geopolitical strategy. It makes you think about what defines a modern trade hub now. Is it the depth of a container port, the bandwidth of fiber optic cables, the efficiency of a logistics airport? The principle is identical. Infrastructure creates the physical capacity for exchange. But all the cranes and warehouses and safe harbors in the world share a single, glaring weakness. They're empty shells without something valuable to put in them. The finest port is useless if the ships arrive with nothing anyone wants to buy. And that leads to the final ingredient, the most volatile one, the one that could make or break a city's destiny overnight. Silk was a whisper, spices were the scent of wealth, the sixth vote went to the goods themselves, the things that flowed through a city's gates, not bulk goods, not grain or timber. But things that were scarce, desirable, valuable for their weight. A single ship of pepper from India could be worth more than an entire fleet of wheat. Cities grew large by moving goods, yes, but they became giants by positioning themselves as gatekeepers, the sole point of access that created a monopoly. And that monopoly created a kind of gravity. It pulled the whole commercial world toward them. Think of the social engine. In a world of rigid hierarchies, displaying rare goods was a language. A lord serving spiced wine on a silk tablecloth wasn't just hosting. He was performing his status. That relentless social demand created the market, and the cities that could reliably supply these symbols won influence. They won profit, they became essential. Venice and Genoa, their duel was a fight over the spice trade. Spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves came from the Moluccas. Islands at the edge of the known world, they traveled a complex route across the Indian Ocean, through the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf into the Levant. The Italian city-states didn't control the source. They fought for the final link, the ports, Alexandria, Beirut, Acre. Whichever city dominated those ports became the sole distributor for Europe. They could set the price, they could reap profits that funded palaces, that funded wars. This was the ultimate high-value trade. A merchant's fortune could fit in a few guarded sacks. But luxury wasn't only from the east. Look north to Novgorod. Its wealth was built on a different scarcity. The vast forests of Russia and Scandinavia yielded furs. Sable, ermine, marten. In the cold castles of Western Europe, these furs were more than warmth. They were the ultimate luxury lining. Novgorod positioned itself as the gateway. It controlled the river routes from the trapping lands to the Baltic. It didn't just collect furs, it established trading posts. It enforced treaties with local tribes. It created a supply chain. Along with furs came other northern treasures, wax for the church candles of Europe, and honey, the primary sweetener before sugar. Novgorod's greatness was built on this boreal bounty. Sometimes the genius was in transformation, taking a raw material and adding value. Flanders is the example. The region didn't produce fine wool. It imported raw, high-quality wool from England, but the cities of Bruges, Ghent, Ypres possessed something rarer. A concentration of skill. Their guilds of weavers and fullers turned that English wool into the finest cloth in Europe, a fabric so sought after it became a currency of prestige. Flanders imported a commodity and exported a luxury. That process anchored its economy for centuries. To secure these goods, cities had to reach beyond their walls. They planted colonies, not for land but for control. Genoa's network in the Black Sea, called Gazaria, was a chain of fortified trading posts. From Kaffa, they controlled the flow of slaves, grain, and silks from the Mongol steppes. From the Caucasus, these outposts were commercial listening posts. They were military anchors. They ensured a Genoese monopoly on key routes. Even a humble resource could become a foundation. If demand was steady and supply was controlled, the Baltic herring trade made Lübeck rich, made the Hanseatic League rich. Every summer, massive herring shoals migrated into the Baltic. The Hanseatic cities didn't just fish, they industrialized the process. They established seasonal camps with vast salting and packing operations. They enforced strict quality control. Hanseatic herring was known to be reliable. They distributed this protein staple across a meat-starved Europe. It was a bulk good, but with such predictable, massive demand that its control generated steady wealth. This dependence was also a vulnerability. A city's fortune was often tied to a single thread in the global tapestry, and if that thread was cut, the wealth could unravel. The classic fear was a shift in the trade routes. What if someone found a way around your gate? The Portuguese voyages around Africa, directly to the spice source in the late 15th century, didn't just challenge Venice's monopoly. It threatened the very logic of its existence. Or if political conflict closed a key pass, if a sultan redirected caravans, a city that was merely a middleman could be left with empty warehouses. With idle ships, it makes you think of modern parallels. What are the spices and silks of today's economy? They might be rare earth minerals for our devices. Advanced semiconductors, patented pharmaceuticals, or data. The cities and nations that control access to these high-value goods define the new trade networks. The principle remains: scarcity plus demand creates a gravitational pull, but controlling goods, securing routes, building infrastructure, all of it required one more thing to function across continents. It required a flow of information. A merchant in Genoa needed to know the price of pepper in Cairo before he sent his ship. A banker in Florence needed news of a war in Flanders before he called in a loan. In an age without instant communication, the speed and reliability of information wasn't just an advantage. It was the difference between a fortune made and a fleet lost. That merchant in Barcelona, he was living right on the edge of a cliff, and the only thing keeping him from falling was a letter. The seventh factor was the communication network. For us, information is instant. Back then, it moved at the speed of wind, the speed of a horse. The gap between a price in Alexandria and a decision in Barcelona could be months. And in that gap, you found either fortune or ruin. A city that mastered the flow of news. It wasn't just trading goods, it was trading uncertainty. That was the ultimate luxury. Efficient networks were the nervous system. They allowed for arbitrage, buying low in one market because you knew the price was high somewhere else. They let merchants coordinate shipments across huge distances, so wool from England could arrive just as the clothmakers in Flanders needed it. And they managed risk, news of pirates gathering or a mountain pass closing from a political fight. That was the difference between sending your ship out or holding it in port. The cities where this news arrived first, they became the brain centers, the places where decisions got made, where capital was allocated, where futures were bet on. The methods were physical. Merchant families, city-states, they set up private courier systems, riders on fast horses carrying sealed letters. The Medici Bank had one. But the most famous was probably the Fugger family from Augsburg. They started in textiles, but their real power came from information. Their agents were in every major city, from Lisbon to Krakow, sending a constant stream of reports. Not just market prices, but political gossip, harvest yields, rumors of royal marriages. The Fugger newsletters were so accurate, so timely, that kings and emperors subscribed to them. Their intelligence apparatus rivaled nations. That was their primary asset. Beyond the private couriers, there were predictable gathering points. The seasonal fairs, like in Champagne, they were as much about information as goods. Merchants from everywhere would meet, share stories, confirm prices, settle accounts. It was a scheduled reset for the world's commercial knowledge. Religious networks played a role too. Monasteries, often on pilgrimage routes, they were way stations. Monks traveled, corresponded with other houses, acted as nodes in a web of news. A Cistercian monk might carry word of a famine in France to Italy, and that news would find its way to the grain merchants in Genoa. All of this worked against a fundamental problem: information asymmetry. When one party knows more than the other, trust evaporates, markets seize up. By building reliable channels, cities reduced that asymmetry. They created a common picture of the world, even if it was delayed. That fostered trust. A merchant was more likely to extend credit, to enter a partnership, if he felt he had a reasonable grasp of the conditions. You see it in the daily rituals. Commercial correspondence, the precursor to the business letter, was meticulously crafted. They contained orders, market commentary, personal news, coded warnings. Public squares served as live tickers. In cities like Bruges or Venice, official commodity prices were posted regularly. Everyone worked from the same baseline. And the speed of rumor was terrifying. An unverified report of war or a shipwreck could trigger a market panic, prices swinging wildly before a confirming letter could arrive weeks later. The design of trading hubs physically embodied this need. Take the Venetian Fondaco dei Tedeschi, the German merchant's warehouse. It wasn't just storage. It was a mandated residence. By law, all German merchants in Venice had to live and work under that roof. That forced co-location meant news from the Baltic, gossip from Augsburg, Venetian market intelligence. It all mixed in the courtyard every day. Deals were made on the stairs, partnerships formed over supper. It streamlined the whole information exchange, made the Fondaco a living, breathing data center. It makes you think about our own world. We've moved from couriers to the internet, from months to milliseconds, but has the fundamental need changed? We still cluster in financial districts. We still pay for premium information. The panic of a rumor now happens on a screen in nanoseconds, instead of a city square over days. The stakes are identical. Timely information is the lifeblood, the true currency that never goes out of style. But information, capital, goods, all these systems required people to run them. And those people didn't just work in a vacuum. They built a whole society around these flows of wealth, with its own rules, its own hierarchies, its own quiet revolutions. The final layer wasn't about geography or goods. It was about the human fabric of the city itself. All those letters and ledgers, they were paper. The eighth ingredient was the city's soul. Its social cohesion, that glue holding it together. There's a painting from the time, a crowd in a city square celebrating their patron saint. The cloth merchants' guild marches under its banner. Then the bankers, then the carpenters, the city council follows. This was a performance of unity, a declaration that everyone, from the wealthiest trader to the dockworker, had a stake in the city's fate. That shared identity was an economic engine. It created a deep, unspoken trust. Commerce flowed smoother and cheaper because of it. The sociologist Max Weber pointed to this civic spirit as a foundation for capitalism. In a place bound by mutual obligation, not a lord's command, people could cooperate on a vast scale. You could trust a contract would be honored. The person who broke it would face not just a court, but the scorn of his entire community. That reduced what economists call transaction costs. The endless checking, the suspicion, the heavy-handed enforcement. When social bonds were strong, deals could be made on a handshake. A man's word was tied to his standing. How did a city build this? Through shared projects. Charitable foundations called hospitals cared for the poor. Funded by merchant donations, religious confraternities brought together men from different trades. Common prayer and charity, softening class lines. Citizens pooled funds for public works, a new fountain, a wider street, not because a king ordered it, because they saw it as an investment in their common home. And every city had its founding myth. Venice told of refugees fleeing barbarians, building a republic on water through divine favor and commercial cunning. These stories glorified the merchant, the trader, the self-made man. They made commerce a civic virtue. The practical benefits were immense. A city with strong civic identity could reach consensus quickly. When a new key was needed, the guilds and councils could debate, decide, and tax themselves to build it. No waiting for a distant monarch's permission. In a dispute, local courts, often staffed by fellow merchants, understood commercial law. They could deliver swift, sensible justice. This created a predictable, efficient business environment. Incredibly attractive to outsiders, consider two models. Florence, with its strong republican traditions. Civic engagement was fierce, if chaotic. Guilds held real political power. Wealthy families competed to build the most beautiful public buildings, a testament to their family and their city. That competitive pride built the Duomo, the palaces, the bridges. Success was measured not just in gold, but in contribution to the city's glory. Now, a city dominated by a single prince. His court might be splendid, but civic engagement often withered. Why invest in a public well if all decisions and glory flow to the prince's castle? The economic energy could become centralized, extractive, less dynamic. The city of Ghent in Flanders shows this communal spirit. Its wealth came from cloth. Its citizens, the merchants, the weavers, the dyers, were fiercely independent. Organized into militias based on their districts. When their count tried to impose taxes that threatened their trade privileges, these citizens didn't just protest. They took up arms. They defeated the count's professional army on more than one occasion. They weren't fighting for a king. They were fighting for their city, for its right to govern its own economic life. That level of collective action was only possible because they saw themselves first and foremost as citizens of Ghent. It makes you wonder. In today's global cities, what creates a shared civic identity? A sports team, a shared response to a crisis, a distinctive cultural scene. And how does that invisible social fabric impact a city's ability to adapt, to innovate, to weather economic storms? The principle endures. Unity is a competitive advantage, but this hard-won unity faced a constant test. The very trade that made the city rich brought in outsiders. Foreign merchants with different customs, different faiths, different languages. The city's cohesive soul now had to decide, would it build walls within its walls? Or could it absorb this new diversity without breaking apart? A city's soul was tested at its gates. The ninth factor was tolerance, but not as an ideal, it was a necessity. A medieval city that could integrate different people didn't just grow. It supercharged its economy. It got access to skills and capital and networks that were otherwise locked away. This was a high-stakes gamble. The rewards could be immense. The risks of conflict were constant. The cities that succeeded learned to manage it. They built legal frameworks for coexistence. Not out of charity, for clear, tangible profit. Take Palermo in Sicily under Norman rule. It was a symphony of languages: Arabic, Greek, Latin, Hebrew. You could walk from the Arab Quarter with its perfumers and mathematicians to the Jewish silk workshops to the Norman administrative halls, all inside the same city wall. Each community brought its own commercial specialty, its own far-flung trade connections. The city became a hybrid marketplace. Goods and ideas from 3 continents met there. This wasn't an accident. The Norman kings actively encouraged it. They protected each community's right to worship, to use its own courts for internal matters. In return, they reaped taxes from a commerce richer and more varied than any rival kingdom could muster. The legal charters tell the story. They're contracts of convenience. A king or city council would grant a privilege to a group of foreign merchants. The Hanseatic merchants in London, for instance, got the Steelyard, a walled compound where they lived under Hanseatic law. They paid taxes to the English crown but governed themselves. They had their own chapel, their own warehouses, their own scales. This wasn't a gift. It was a deal. The city got a guaranteed flow of northern goods: timber, furs, wax, herring, and the tax revenue that came with it. The merchants got security and predictability. They didn't have to navigate unfamiliar English common law for every dispute over a barrel of tar. This model was replicated everywhere. German merchants in Venice lived in the Fondaco dei Tedeschi. Venetian merchants in Alexandria had their own Fondaco. Jewish communities across Europe often received charters of protection. They were allowed to practice money lending, a trade forbidden to Christians by the church. This filled a crucial economic niche. It provided the credit that fueled trade and even royal projects. In return, the Jewish community paid heavy taxes directly to the crown, becoming a valuable financial asset. Their protection was real, but it was always conditional, tied directly to their economic utility. Cordoba, during the height of Muslim rule in Spain, became a legendary center of learning and commerce because of this relative tolerance. Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived under a system that, while not equal, allowed for collaboration. Scholars translated ancient Greek texts from Arabic into Latin. Artisans shared techniques. This cross-pollination created advances in medicine, astronomy, agriculture. The economic boom followed. Cordoba became one of the largest, most prosperous cities in the world. Its markets were filled with goods from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Its intellectual capital attracted the best minds. That golden age was built on a pragmatic, if imperfect, social contract. But this tolerance had sharp limits. It was a privilege, not a right, and it could be revoked in an instant. During times of crisis, a plague, a famine, a military defeat, the foreigner, the minority, was a convenient scapegoat. The same Jewish bankers who were essential in one decade could be expelled in the next, their assets seized by the crown. The Hanseatic merchants could find their privileges suspended if a local king decided to favor his own merchants. The economic damage from these expulsions was often severe. Cities that expelled their Jewish communities frequently saw their financial sectors crumble. The expertise and capital simply left, moving to more welcoming cities and taking their networks with them. Integration also brought invisible threats. The constant movement of people and goods was a highway for illness. A ship from the east might bring spices. It might also bring contagion. The crowded, diverse quarters of a trading hub were the most vulnerable. Public health was a constant, low-grade crisis. Cities that thrived had to develop basic systems to manage it: quarantines for arriving ships, regulations on waste disposal, not from advanced science but from grim experience. The benefits of diversity came with this profound physical vulnerability. It makes you reflect on our own time. How modern debates about immigration and economic dynamism echo these ancient patterns. The tension between the clear economic benefits of diverse skills and global connections and the perennial fear of social disruption is not new. It was being negotiated in the charters of medieval Bruges and the streets of Norman Palermo. The cities that mastered that negotiation, however imperfectly, gained an edge that was both cultural and fiercely commercial. They became bridges between worlds. But a bridge, by its nature, is exposed. It feels every shift in the wind, and the greatest shift of all was not social but physical, a change in the very pathways of the world. A ship on the horizon, it wasn't always welcome. It could be a carrier of ruin. That 10th factor was public health. In a world connected by trade, the ships that brought silk and spices also brought invisible passengers. Devastating ones. Managing sanitation and disease in a city wasn't about comfort. It was a brutal economic calculation. A single outbreak could erase a generation of workers. It could shatter the trust that held long-distance partnerships together. A port known for plague would be avoided. Like a reef, commerce would just flow somewhere else. So the cities that endured, the ones that kept their networks through these crises, they were the ones that took grim steps, pragmatic steps. They invented the tools of public health out of sheer necessity. The most famous response was quarantine. The word comes from the Italian quaranta, meaning 40. In the 1300s, Ragusa passed a law. That's what we call Dubrovnik now. Any ship arriving from an area suspected of plague had to anchor offshore. Its crew and cargo had to wait in isolation for 30 days. They called it a trentina. Later, other cities extended it. Venice made it 40 days. This wasn't based on advanced medicine. It was based on observation. A period of isolation seemed to stop the illness from spreading into the city. It was a radical act, halting commerce, the lifeblood of the city, in order to save it. That balance between economic flow and biological safety defined a city's resilience. Beyond the harbor, cities established their first boards of health, committees of leading citizens given extraordinary powers during an outbreak. They could enforce quarantines of individual houses, marked with a cross on the door. They could restrict movement between districts. They organized the removal of the deceased. In Milan, records show these boards implemented what we'd call cordons sanitaires. They walled up entire streets where illness was found. They provided food to those inside through small openings, but allowed no one out. It was a harsh strategy. Often desperate, but in several instances it worked. Milan frequently suffered less than its neighbors. Its markets stayed open longer. Its government kept a reputation for control. That stability, however grim, preserved its commercial standing. Daily urban life was a constant health challenge. Think of the smells, the narrow streets. Butchers slaughtering animals in open shops, waste tossed from windows. These weren't just nuisances, they were breeding grounds for illness that could cripple a workforce. So progressive city councils passed ordinances. They mandated regular street cleaning. They ordered butchers to move their operations downstream, away from drinking water sources. They funded the construction of covered sewers, however basic. They built public fountains for clean water. Each measure was an investment in the city's human capital. A healthier population was a more productive one. It could keep the workshops humming and the docks busy. The sick and the destitute were also an economic problem. A merchant seeing beggars dying in the streets might question the city's fundamental order. So cities and merchant guilds funded hospitals, not like modern hospitals, but places of refuge and basic care. Leprosaria, houses for those with leprosy, were built outside the walls. This served a dual purpose. It provided charitable care, fulfilling a religious duty. And it removed the visibly ill from the daily commerce of the city. That reduced fear. It maintained an atmosphere of normalcy. These institutions were acts of social hygiene as much as medicine. The economic impact of a pandemic was a paradox. The Black Death, the most devastating one, wiped out maybe half of Europe's population in the 14th century. For those who survived, labor became scarce, wages for skilled workers soared. carpenters, weavers, but for the city as a commercial engine, the damage was catastrophic. Complex supply chains snapped, merchant families were wiped out, their capital and knowledge were lost, credit markets froze, because who could be trusted to repay a loan when the future was so uncertain? Trading partnerships that had taken decades to build vanished overnight. A city's recovery depended on how quickly it could re-establish those networks. Attract new workers, restore confidence. Cities with stronger pre-existing institutions, like those health boards and clear laws, often managed that recovery faster. They presented a face of competence. It makes you reflect on our own interconnected age, how pandemic responses test the resilience of a global trade hub today. The principle is unchanged. The flow of goods depends on the health of the people who move them, make them, and buy them. A port that can manage a crisis, that can assure partners of its safety and order, retains its place in the network. One that cannot falls behind, but keeping a population healthy required more than managing disease. It required feeding them. A hungry city was a fragile one, no matter how tall its walls. And securing a stable food supply was the next great challenge for any would-be trade giant. A city's stomach determined its fate. The 11th factor was the agricultural hinterland. That ring of farms and pastures around a city, it was the biological engine. Without a steady flow of calories from the countryside, a city couldn't grow. No artisan could spend their day weaving or forging iron. They'd be back in the fields just trying to eat, so the relationship was a deep symbiosis. The city was a permanent, hungry market for the countryside's grain and livestock. In return, it offered farmers a place to sell their surplus and to buy the city's goods, tools, cloth, pottery. That created a local economic loop. Everything else ran on that. Think of the barges on the Seine carrying grain into Paris, or the wagons coming into London from Kent. This wasn't occasional trade, it was the city's daily bread, literally. Cities in fertile plains like Prague on its river had a built-in advantage. Their food supply was short, reliable, cheap to move. That stability let them grow, let them specialize, become more than a large market town. Economists call it central place theory. A city becomes the central market for all the villages nearby. It provides services those villages can't produce, and it draws all their agricultural surplus into its stores. The city's size is tied directly to the land's productivity around it, and to how efficiently it can pull that bounty inside. So how did cities secure this flow? Through politics, investment, and force. Some, like German free cities, directly controlled the farmland around their walls. They governed those villages. They set the rules for what was grown and sold. That was food security through domination. Others used long-term contracts. A city council would sign an agreement with a rural monastery or a lord, promising to buy a fixed amount of grain every year at a fair price. That gave farmers a guaranteed market. It gave the city a predictable supply, but contracts were useless if the food couldn't get there. So cities invested in the arteries of bulk transport. They maintained the roads into town. More importantly, they dredged rivers and built canals. Moving grain by water was far cheaper than by wagon. A single barge could carry the load of dozens of carts. Cities on navigable rivers, like Cologne on the Rhine, could tap into the wealth of entire regions upstream. Their hinterland wasn't just the land nearby, it was the entire river basin. Then came storage. A smart city built granaries, massive, dry, rat-proof warehouses. They'd buy grain after a good harvest when prices were low and store it. That created a buffer. If the next harvest failed or if a war blocked the routes, the city could release its reserves. That prevented famine. It prevented the panic that could topple a government. The granary was a civic insurance policy. Market regulations were another tool. City councils passed laws against hoarding, against selling grain outside the city during a shortage. they appointed official grain measurers to ensure fair weight. They set maximum prices for bread in a crisis. These weren't acts of charity, they were acts of stability. A hungry population was a riotous population. And nothing destroyed commercial confidence faster than streets in unrest. The vulnerability was stark for cities without a rich hinterland. The Italian maritime republics, like Genoa and Venice, were built on rocky coasts or islands. They couldn't feed themselves. Their survival depended on long, fragile supply lines across the sea. They needed Sicilian wheat, Black Sea grain from their colonies. A single bad harvest in Sicily or a war that closed the Bosporus could send panic through Venice. The price of bread would skyrocket. The poor would suffer. The entire social order would tremble. Their magnificent wealth was balanced on a thread of ships carrying the most basic commodity. Contrast that with a city like York in England. Its rise as a trading center for wool was underpinned by its location. It sat in the heart of the Vale of York, a rich agricultural region. Its immediate hinterland provided the food to feed its weavers and merchants. That local security gave it a solid foundation. It could then focus on long-distance trade in high-value wool. The hinterland supported the population. The population produced the goods for trade. It makes you reflect on now. Today's mega-cities are often detached from their food sources. A supermarket in New York or Tokyo is the endpoint of a global chain across oceans. The strategic risk is immense. A disruption, a pandemic, a conflict in a shipping lane, a drought in a breadbasket region echoes the ancient fear of the Venetian grain ship not arriving. How do modern cities manage this? With global logistics, strategic reserves, and a faith in the system's resilience that would make a medieval grain commissioner nervous. Feeding a population did more than prevent riots. It was the prerequisite for everything. It freed human labor. When enough people don't have to farm, they can become weavers, metalworkers, bankers. That specialization is the foundation of value-added trade. It's what turns wool into fine cloth or into tools. The fertile hinterland was the silent, muddy foundation for the glittering towers of commerce. But a city fed, defended, and connected still faced one final test, an internal test, the test of its own institutions. Could its government make decisions not for this year's profit, but for the next generation's survival? The sound of a hammer on brass, that was a city creating its wealth, not just trading it. This 12th factor was craft specialization, moving past the exchange of raw materials into the art of making things. Cities that mastered this didn't just move value, they built it. They kept more of the profit, and they built advantages that were difficult to copy. You could hear it in the different quarters, the clatter of looms in one district, the hiss of molten glass in another, the pounding of metal workers. Each sound was a deep pool of skill, a concentration of knowledge that turned wool into legendary cloth or sand into glass. Economists call this agglomeration. Similar industries clustering together, creating something greater than the parts. That was the reality in medieval hubs centuries ago. Take the cities of Flanders. Bruges, Ghent, Ypres, they didn't have their own high-quality wool. They imported it raw from England, but they had something rarer, a dense concentration of skilled labor. Organized into powerful guilds of weavers, fullers, dyers, these craftsmen didn't just make cloth, they perfected it. Through generations, they developed techniques for a fabric of unmatched fineness. Flemish cloth became a brand, sold from Novgorod to Seville. The city's entire identity was built around this one process. They transformed a commodity into a luxury. This specialization needed infrastructure, energy. The fulling of cloth was backbreaking work, but in Flanders they harnessed water power. They built water mills along the rivers for this task. That mechanization increased output. It was an early industrial revolution powered by rivers. Metalworking centers in Germany, like Nuremberg, thrived from local ore, forests for charcoal, waterways for transport. The entire local ecosystem supported the craft. Within these clusters, innovation spread. A dyer might discover a new, vibrant red. That knowledge, though guarded, would eventually spread through the quarter. Lifting the quality of the entire city's output, guilds played a dual role. They regulated quality fiercely, protecting the city's reputation, but they also controlled knowledge. Protecting secrets through long apprenticeships and oaths. This created a paradox. It maintained high standards but could stifle radical innovation from outside. The power and the peril of this model is shown by a smaller city, Dinant, on the Meuse River. Dinant became so specialized in brassware, elaborate candlesticks and basins that its name became synonymous with the product across Europe. Dinant was brass. Its entire economy was focused on this one industry. For generations, this brought immense wealth, but it created a profound vulnerability. In 1466, the city was sacked, workshops destroyed, craftsmen scattered. Because Dinant had put all its eggs in one basket, the blow was catastrophic. It never fully recovered, a stark lesson in the risks of over-specialization. So the modern equivalents, Silicon Valley for technology, the fashion districts of Milan. Automotive networks in southern Germany, regions where a dense concentration of skill, suppliers, and knowledge creates a gravitational pull. The principle of agglomeration is timeless. But all this crafted wealth, these workshops buzzing with activity, would mean little in a lawless market. The fruits of this labor needed a system for fair exchange. A set of rules everyone agreed to play by. That merchant from Genoa, he needed a court, more than a handshake. The 13th factor was the legal framework. In a world of fragmented kingdoms, a contract from one city meant nothing in the next. Commerce would have just frozen. So the cities that thrived, they built something. A system of rules that traveled with the goods, a law of the sea and the marketplace that stood above any local lord. This wasn't about lofty justice. It was practical certainty. If your ship sank, who paid? If a partner vanished with the silver, what then? The answers couldn't be decided by a sword. They needed a gavel that gave rise to the law merchant, Lex Mercatoria, a body of customary law that came from the merchants themselves. It was international. Flexible, fast, its core principle was reciprocity. A merchant who cheated in one market would find himself excluded from all of them. Reputation was the ultimate collateral. This law lived in the customs of the great fairs. At the champagne fairs, they had special courts, pea-powder courts, from the French pied poudre, dusty foot. For the traveling merchants, their feet still dusty from the road. These courts promised justice before the fair ended, before the merchant had to move on. Disputes over quality, payment, partnership settled on the spot. The ultimate penalty was expulsion from the fair network, a commercial death sentence. This self-enforcing system kept order among thousands of strangers. On the water, the need was even more acute. Maritime codes emerged. The most famous in the north were the Rolls d'Oléron. Judgments from the island of Oléron off the French coast. These rules dealt with the gritty realities. If a sailor had to jettison cargo to save a ship in a storm, who bore the loss? The Rolls decreed all merchants with goods on board would share the cost, proportionally. That was the early principle of general average, a form of maritime insurance. It spread the risk, made voyages more feasible. The rules covered everything: the wages of a pilot guiding a ship into harbor, the liability for a cask of wine that broke open in the hold. A predictable script for disaster. Cities that championed these laws became magnets. Barcelona's Consulate of the Sea, the Consolat de Mar, was a tribunal of merchant judges. It heard cases between merchants of any nationality. Its rulings were respected across the Mediterranean. They were seen as neutral, expert, swift. A Genoese merchant would rather take a dispute there than before some local noble who knew nothing of bills of lading. That reputation for fair dispute resolution brought business. It made Barcelona a clearinghouse for contracts. Then there was the notary, the unsung hero. In Genoa, Florence, notaries recorded everything: sales, loans, partnerships, wills. Their ledgers created a paper trail. A notarized contract carried weight far from home. A precursor to the modern legal document, this bureaucracy of trust was essential for credit. You could lend money to a merchant in another city because the contract, witnessed by a notary, gave you a claim other courts would recognize. These frameworks did something. They reduced transaction costs, the time, energy, risk of making a deal, by standardizing contracts, defining liability, offering reliable arbitration. They made long-distance trade less of a gamble. They turned commerce from personal bets into a system. You could plan, you could invest, you could sue, not fight. It makes you consider our world. Modern international trade rests on a web of treaties. Arbitration courts, the World Trade Organization, International Chamber of Commerce courts, they are the direct descendants of the P-Powder courts and the Rolls-Dollaren. They provide a neutral ground, a set of known rules for a dispute between a company in one country and a supplier in another. The need for a predictable legal environment, a law above local whim, is just as urgent now. But all these contracts, all these judgments, they needed a common language to be settled. A dispute might be resolved in court, but the payment itself required something everyone would accept. The verdict was worthless without a reliable medium to fulfill it. That necessity gave birth to the next critical innovation, one that would transform abstract value into tangible, transferable power. A silver penny would pass from hand to hand, but the real transaction was in the eyes, the merchant feeling its weight, examining the imprint, judging the fineness of the metal. That moment of scrutiny, that was the 14th factor, the monetary system. In a marketplace of 1,000 goods, money was the common language. A reliable, abundant currency turned chaotic barter into smooth exchange. It let a merchant in Cairo price silk in the same terms as a banker in Florence. Cities that mastered this language, that minted trusted coins, they positioned themselves at the heart of financial power. They didn't just facilitate trade, they governed its rhythm. Money performed 3 essential functions. A failure in any one could paralyze a city. First, as a medium of exchange. Instead of trading your wool directly for wine, you sold the wool for coins, then used those coins to buy the wine. That simple step unlocked commerce. Second, as a unit of account, it let everything be priced in a common standard. A contract could specify payment in so many silver pennies. That created certainty. Third, as a store of value, a merchant could save his profits in coin, trusting it would hold its worth for a future purchase. When a king debased the currency, reducing the silver, he shattered that trust. Prices soared, long-term contracts became meaningless, commerce seized up like a rusty machine. The right to mint coins was a coveted privilege, often granted by kings to loyal or wealthy cities. It was a license to print wealth, but also a profound responsibility. A city's mint mark became its brand, the Florentine florin, first struck in 1252. And the Venetian ducat a few decades later. They became the gold standard of their day, literally. Their consistent weight and purity made them trusted across borders. An Egyptian sultan would accept Venetian ducats for spices because he knew their value was unwavering. These were the first true international trade coins. They turned Florence and Venice into the financial capitals of Europe, the places where large accounts were settled, where grand ventures were funded. But not every city had gold. In the Baltic, the Hanseatic cities led by Lubeck faced a jungle of different currencies, often debased. Their solution was cooperation. They formed the Wendish Coinage Union, an agreement to standardize the silver coinage across member cities. A coin from Lubeck would have the same silver content as one from Hamburg or Wismar. This created a zone of monetary stability across northern trade routes. It reduced the need for constant exchange. It was a financial peace treaty. It boosted commerce for all. Within the city walls, the money changers' tables were the nervous system. A merchant arriving from France with livres tournois needed to change them into local pennies. To pay for lodging and goods, the money changer with his scales and touchstones assessed each foreign coin. He took a small fee. His knowledge was critical. He had to know exchange rates for dozens of currencies and detect counterfeits. From these benches, early banking emerged. A merchant might deposit his heavy coins with a trusted changer for safekeeping. He'd receive a paper receipt. That receipt could sometimes be used to make payments, an early form of paper money. The greatest threat to the whole system was scarcity. The Great Bullion Famine of the 15th century was a slow-motion crisis. Silver mines in Europe were exhausted. New sources from the Americas weren't yet found. The physical amount of coined silver in circulation shrank. This caused deflation. Prices fell, but so did economic activity. It became harder to get loans. Merchants hoarded good coins. Trade contracted because the very medium of exchange was disappearing. It showed how the entire edifice of commerce rested on a physical foundation. Of precious metal, control over money was the ultimate leverage. A city with a strong mint and honest coinage attracted merchants like a magnet. It could finance its walls, its fleet, its public works from the seigniorage. The profit made from minting, conversely, a ruler who repeatedly debased his currency was burning the bridge of trust. He might raise short-term funds, but he would drive commerce to more reliable neighbors. The flight of capital and talent could be swift and devastating. It makes you reflect on our own digital age. We no longer bite coins to test them, but the core question remains the same. What constitutes trusted coinage today? Is it the stability of a national currency backed by a central bank? The cryptographic certainty of a blockchain, the reputation of a digital payment network, we still seek that same foundation, that universal token of value that allows complex, long-distance trade to function with confidence. The metal has changed, but the need for trust in the medium of exchange is eternal, and that trust, once established, allowed cities to dream on a scale previously unimaginable. It enabled them to fund ventures that spanned years and oceans, to build not for the next season but for the next century. A letter of credit was paper, but it was also a handshake. A long-distance partnership, that was the 15th factor, the alliance. An isolated city was vulnerable, but cities woven together into a web of trusted relationships, they could share risks. They could access distant markets. They could weather storms that would sink any merchant working alone. This human architecture, this institutional architecture, turned dangerous frontiers into routes you could manage. The Hanseatic League is the famous example, but it wasn't a single state. It was more like a defensive coalition, a coalition of merchant towns. From London to Novgorod, these cities bound themselves together by mutual interest. They agreed on common laws for trade. They promised to defend each other's merchants. So if a prince in England seized the goods of a merchant from Lübeck, the entire Hanse might embargo English wool. That collective power let them negotiate treaties. They could negotiate with kings. They secured trading privileges. They fixed tariffs. They established these fortified trading posts abroad called contours. The Steelyard in London, the Peterhof in Novgorod, these were bubbles of Hanseatic law on foreign soil. A merchant from Cologne arriving in Novgorod, he didn't enter a strange land. He entered a familiar compound. His own people were there, his own courts, his own warehouses. That drastically lowered the fear. It lowered the cost of doing business thousands of miles from home. A different model flourished in Italy, the family firm, the Medici of Florence, the Bardi, the Peruzzi. These weren't just rich families, they were multinational corporations before the concept really existed. They built networks through kinship, through apprenticeship. A young cousin would be sent, or a trusted apprentice, sent to run the branch office in Bruges, or London, or Alexandria. These agents were called factors. They lived abroad permanently. They were the eyes and ears and hands of the home office. They bought and sold on instruction. They gathered intelligence, politics, and prices. They extended credit to local merchants, weaving the family deeper into the regional economy. Their loyalty was ensured by blood ties. By the promise of future partnership, this created a spiderweb of trusted nodes across Europe and the Levant. It moved money, it moved goods. It moved information with remarkable speed for that era. These partnerships functioned on a bedrock of reputation. In the law merchant, a merchant's word was his bond. Cheat one partner and the news would travel the network. You'd be excluded from future deals. This self-policing system made long-term relationships more valuable than any single fraudulent gain. It allowed for instruments like the bill of exchange. A merchant in Venice could pay a supplier in Bruges by giving him a bill, a promise of payment from the Venetian's agent in London. No heavy silver had to cross the Alps. The entire transaction rested on trust, the trust that each link in the chain would honor its commitment. Alliances also had a diplomatic dimension. A military dimension. The Hanseatic League could wage economic warfare. They could blockade a river, boycott a prince's goods to force favorable terms. The Catalan company presents a hybrid. It began as a band of mercenaries, but their campaigns opened trade routes. They secured territories. Their military power created safe passage for Catalan merchants. And their commercial activities funded further campaigns. Martial and commercial interests were two sides of the same coin, securing profit through force. And force through profit, yet these alliances had limits. They were held together by shared interest, not central command. Internal rivalries could fracture them. The Hanse's decline came from many pressures. The rise of powerful nation-states, England and Muscovy, states that no longer needed to bargain with a league of cities. The shifting trade routes away from the Baltic, and perhaps a failure to adapt their decentralized model to a new world of centralized kingdoms. Their strength, cooperation among equals, became a weakness when facing unified rivals. It makes you reflect on today's economic landscape, how modern multinational corporations, with their global supply chains and branch offices, echo the medieval family firm. How free trade zones and economic unions like the European Union function as successors to the Hanseatic League. They create integrated spaces with common rules. They reduce the friction of cross-border trade. The goal remains unchanged, to build a framework of trust and predictability across distances, turning the map from a patchwork of risks into a network of opportunity. But even the most sophisticated network faces a constant threat, an invisible threat, not from rival merchants, not from princes, but from the very environment that made trade possible. The sternpost rudder was a quiet kind of revolution. It didn't sound like a battle, but it changed the map. This 16th factor was about technology in transport and navigation. A city could have the best laws, the shrewdest merchants, but if its ships were slow, if its roads were mud, its wealth would eventually stall. The cities that thrived were the ones that embraced better ways to move things. They turned small advances into big commercial advantages. Every reduction in cost, every extra mile a ship could sail, it redrew the lines, it shifted economic gravity. The historian Lynn White Jr. wrote about this, a medieval technological revolution, a cascade of small improvements that reshaped what was possible. On the water, the changes were profound. For centuries, the Mediterranean was dominated by the oared galley, fast, maneuverable, but limited cargo space, a huge crew to feed. Perfect for war, for short hauls of luxury goods, but for the bulk trade that built empires, you needed a new ship, so you get the cog, a sturdy, round-hulled sailing ship from the Baltic. Its single square sail, its clinker-built hull, could weather northern storms. It could carry more cargo, timber, grain, herring barrels with a much smaller crew. That was an efficiency breakthrough. It made shipping bulk goods across the North Sea profitable. Hanseatic ports like Lübeck and Hamburg built fleets of them. Their cogs became the trucks of the northern seas. Then two other inventions supercharged this. The sternpost rudder, mounted centrally on the back, it replaced the side steering oar. It gave the helmsman far greater control, especially in heavy seas, and the adoption of the lateen sail, a triangular sail from Arab design. It let ships sail closer to the wind. A vessel rigged with both, like the later carrack, became a versatile machine. It could carry spices from the Levant and survive an Atlantic gale. Navigation kept pace. The magnetic compass, likely from China, went from a curiosity to an essential tool. Combined with the Portolan chart, these detailed sailing instructions noting coastlines and hazards, it reduced the fear of the open sea. A captain could sail on overcast days away from sight of land. That opened new, more direct routes, and this wasn't just about bravery, it was about predictability. About speed, a reliable voyage meant lower insurance, lower costs, more trips per season. On land, the revolution was harnessed, literally. The old throat and girth harness choked a horse when it pulled. The new padded horse collar, arriving around the 10th century, transferred the weight to the animal's shoulders. A horse could pull 3 to 4 times more. That transformed overland cartage. Heavier wagons with better axles could move more goods. The cost of moving grain 50 miles inland plummeted. Cities connected to fertile land by good roads could draw from a much wider area. But the most ambitious projects aimed to bend geography itself. Canals. The Stecknitz Canal in northern Germany finished in the late 14th century. It connected the Elbe River to the Baltic Sea. It let salt from Lüneburg reach Lübeck's herring packers without going around Denmark. It created a new protected corridor. Later, the Canal du Midi in France did a similar trick, linking the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. These were staggering investments, undertaken because the payoff, controlling a new route, was worth decades of labor. The ultimate lesson came from the Portuguese caravel in the 15th century. A sleek, maneuverable ship combining lateen and square sails. It was the tool that let explorers like Vasco da Gama sail down Africa into the Indian Ocean. This single technological edge didn't just improve a route, it invented a new one. It bypassed the entire Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the caravans, the old gatekeepers Venice, Genoa. The Mamluks found their monopolies crumbling. A new hub, Lisbon, sat at the center of a global map. It makes you reflect on our own time, how container shipping, aviation, digital logistics have redefined trade. A deep water port in Shanghai becomes a new kind of cog, moving mountains of goods. Air freight makes flowers from Kenya a staple in London. Digital platforms move software instantly. The principle is unchanged. A leap in transport technology doesn't just make old things cheaper, it makes new things possible. It reroutes the world's wealth. And just as a new sail design could doom a city, a new digital protocol can elevate or erase an economic hub today. But technology didn't just move goods. It began to transform the goods themselves and the very nature of work. A pilgrim's scallop shell was a receipt, proof you'd made the journey, and that journey fueled an entire economy. This 17th factor was religious institutions and pilgrimage traffic. While merchants moved for spices, another traveler moved with the same certainty. The pilgrim, their journey wasn't for profit, but their needs created profit everywhere they stopped. This was mass tourism, centuries before the word existed. It could turn a quiet town into a hub, completely outside the usual rules of trade. The road to Santiago de Compostela in Spain maps this perfectly. Pilgrims from all over Europe converging on one destination. They needed food at inns called hospitales. They needed safe bridges. They needed shoes repaired, coins exchanged, souvenirs, badges, little flasks for holy water to prove they'd been there. Every need was a business. Towns along the route, like Conques or Leon, grew wealthy not from making things but from servicing this human flow. Guidebooks from the time, like the Codex Calixtinus, didn't just list holy sites. They listed the best inns, the reliable ferrymen, the places with clean water. They were the first tourist manuals shaping where money went. The destinations themselves became powerhouses. A major shrine like Canterbury in England or the Vatican in Rome needed a vast support system, scribes producing indulgences, candlemakers working day and night, stonemasons building cathedral expansions for the crowds, taverns, stables, souvenir stalls crowding the approaches. This created a permanent service industry, humming year-round, centered on an idea, not a port. Religious institutions were more than magnets. They were sophisticated economic entities. Monasteries, especially the Cistercian order, were pioneers of large-scale agriculture. They cleared forests, drained swamps, managed vast sheep runs. Their wool became a major export, funding their mission and tying them into trade networks like the Champagne fairs. A Cistercian abbey was often the most advanced business in the region. The church's own needs drove financial innovation. Moving papal taxes from England to Rome was a logistical nightmare. Funding a crusade in Jerusalem from donations in Paris. This necessity created specialized services. The military orders, particularly the Knights Templar, became the answer. They started as warrior monks protecting pilgrims, but to protect a pilgrim's wealth, they created a system. A pilgrim could deposit funds at a Templar house in London. He got a coded letter. Traveling to Jerusalem, he could present that letter at the Templar fortress there and withdraw the equivalent in local currency. His money traveled safely without ever moving. The Templars, with their network of fortified houses across Europe and the Levant, became the first true international bankers. Their vaults were more secure than any king's treasury. Their financial trust was built on their religious vow and their military might. This spiritual economy even set the calendar. Religious feast days dictated the timing of fairs. The Fair of St. Denis near Paris, the Fair of St. Bartholomew in London. Their dates were fixed to saints' days, guaranteeing a crowd. The liturgical year created rhythms of demand. Lent created a market for fish. Major festivals required special cloth, wine, wax for candles. Commerce danced to a sacred timetable. The vulnerability was absolute. A city whose entire identity was tied to a pilgrimage faced existential risk. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century didn't just change theology. It shattered economies. When pilgrimage to saints' shrines was declared idolatry, the traffic stopped. Towns that had grown rich on the Canterbury Trail saw their inns empty, markets quiet. Their reason for being evaporated overnight. Similarly, when the Knights Templar were suppressed in the early 14th century, their banking network collapsed, causing a financial crisis across Europe. Faith had built these structures, and a shift in faith could topple them. It makes you consider our world. What are our secular pilgrimages? The annual influx to the Super Bowl or the Olympic Games? The steady stream to Silicon Valley or Hollywood? The Hajj remains a powerful example of faith-driven travel on a colossal scale. These modern events create the same linear and nodal economies. They demand hotels, transportation, security, souvenirs, an entire ecosystem of services. Wherever people are drawn in large numbers for any deeply held purpose, an economy grows around their journey. The scallop shell is replaced by a ticket stub or a conference badge, but the economic logic of the path remains the same. A temporary city of canvas and wood could hold more wealth than a town with stone walls. That was the power of a fair. The 18th factor was this cycle of fairs, these seasonal markets. They were the heartbeat of long-distance trade before you had permanent exchanges. For a few weeks, a muddy field in Champagne would become the commercial center of Europe. Merchants from Flanders, Italy, Germany, they all timed their journeys to be there. And they weren't just trading goods, they were settling accounts from deals made months before. They were taking in news from distant markets. They were starting new fashions that would spread across the continent. A city that hosted a successful fair captured a flood of wealth, even if it was temporary. That influx could pay for permanent things: a new bridge, a stronger gate, a grander church, and that would cement the town's status. The anatomy of a major fair was really about scheduling. Take the famous cycle in Champagne. It wasn't one event, it was a rotating circuit of 6 fairs through the year. Each one had its specialty. The fair at Troyes might focus on cloth and leather. The next one at Provence would handle spices and bullion, and the final fair in the cycle was often the money fair. That was critical. After weeks of trading on credit, merchants needed to settle their books. They exchanged bills, they paid debts in coin, they balanced the ledgers. This structured cycle created a predictable rhythm for all of European commerce. A merchant could plan his entire year around it. To attract this kind of mobile wealth, host towns offered extraordinary privileges. The Counts of Champagne guaranteed safe conduct. A merchant traveling to the fair, even through a rival lord's lands, was under the Count's protection. And within the fairgrounds, local laws were suspended. In their place, you had the law merchant. Special courts, they called them pea-powder courts for the dusty-footed travelers. They gave swift justice. A dispute over wool quality or a broken contract could be resolved before the fair packed up. This created a bubble of predictability, a bubble of trust in a fragmented world. It was a neutral ground where business came first, not politics. Beyond the transactions, fairs were incredible information hubs. In the taverns and the stalls, a Genoese merchant would learn about a new dye from the east. A Flemish weaver would hear about a shift in English wool prices. A German banker would pick up rumors of war in Lombardy. This face-to-face intelligence was irreplaceable. It shaped decisions for the whole next year, and fairs launched trends. A new style of hat from Milan, a new cut of cloth from Ghent, could become the must-have item for nobles everywhere by the next season. The fair was a marketplace, but it was also a broadcast tower. Some of these temporary events planted permanent roots. The Frankfurt Fair, for instance, started as a seasonal market. Its success, its reliable schedule and fair administration, gradually attracted a permanent population of merchants and bankers. Over centuries, it turned into one of Germany's lasting commercial centers. The temporary scaffolding hardened into a city, but the nature of this advantage was transient. The Champagne fairs began to decline in the 14th century. Political instability in the region played a part, but more decisively, the map of trade was redrawing itself. Direct sea routes from Italian city-states to the North Sea, bypassing the overland trails through France, became safer and more reliable. Why haul goods by wagon to a field in Champagne when a ship could carry more for less cost straight to Bruges or London? The economic logic that made the fairs essential just evaporated. The temporary city faded, and the host towns had to find a new reason to exist. It makes you think about the rhythm of our own commercial world. How modern trade shows, conventions, even financial quarters like Wall Street continue this legacy. They're still concentrated, periodic gatherings. They still run on synchronized schedules: fashion weeks, tech expos, quarterly reports. They still offer a temporary zone for deal-making, for trend spotting, for building networks. The canvas tents are now convention centers, but the human impulse to cluster, to trade, to settle accounts in a dedicated time and place, that's still a powerful force. But this rhythm of commerce was always set against larger historical currents, forces that could sweep away even the most brilliantly organized fair. A distant Khan could issue one decree and the wealth of continents would reroute. That's the 19th factor: macro-historical events, the Crusades, the Mongol conquests. These weren't just chapters in a book, they were tsunamis. They reshaped the entire economic coastline. For a trading city, it was the ultimate lottery. Unimaginable fortune or utter ruin, decided by forces completely outside its control. Take the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. In the 13th century, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific to the Black Sea. That created something unprecedented: a single, relatively safe corridor across the whole Eurasian landmass. For the first time, a merchant could travel from the Crimean port of Soldaya all the way to Beijing under one authority. The risk from bandits and rival warlords just plummeted. The Silk Road wasn't just open, it was supercharged. This macro event took obscure way stations and turned them into global hubs. Cities like Tabriz in Persia, Kaffa on the Crimean coast, suddenly they were at the crossroads of the world. They became the places where Chinese silks met Persian ceramics and European silver. The accounts of travelers like Marco Polo who journeyed under this peace, they weren't just tales of wonder. They were commercial intelligence, mapping a new world of opportunity for the Venetian and Genoa merchants who followed. The Crusades were a different kind of economic engine. For 2 centuries, they created a sustained, massive demand. Everything an army and a colony needed. Ships, that was the first requirement. Tens of thousands of knights, pilgrims, settlers, all had to be moved from Europe to the Levant. That single need made the fortunes of the Italian maritime republics. Genoa, Venice, Pisa, their shipyards worked non-stop. They weren't just transporters, they were the logistical backbone. They supplied the Crusader states with arms, timber, food. And they financed the ventures. Kings and nobles took huge loans to fund their expeditions. But the Crusades did more than provide a service industry. They exposed European elites to a world of luxury goods they barely knew existed. Sugar, citrus fruits, sophisticated textiles, new spices. When knights returned home, they brought a taste for these things with them. That created a permanent, growing demand. A demand that Italian merchants were perfectly positioned to satisfy. It locked in their commercial dominance for generations. Yet these events were brutally selective. For every city that rose, another fell. The Mongol destruction of Baghdad in 1258. For centuries, Baghdad had been the brilliant capital of the Islamic world. A hub of learning and commerce on the Tigris, the siege and its aftermath were a profound human tragedy, and the city's role as a central nexus for trade, it never fully recovered. The economic gravity of the region shifted. Caravan routes moved north, away from the ravaged heartland, toward the safer pastures of the Mongol Ilkhanate. That boosted cities like Tabriz and later cities on the Black Sea coast. They became the new terminals for goods moving between Asia and Europe. The life and death of Acre shows this precarious brilliance. Acre was the final capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. For much of the 13th century, it was a thriving, chaotic emporium, a mosaic of Italian merchant quarters, Crusader castles, bustling markets, where Arabic, Italian, and French were spoken in the same breath. It was the primary gateway for Eastern goods into the European economy. Its wealth was entirely the product of the Crusader presence. But when the Mamluks finally captured the city in 1291, that economic reason for being vanished overnight, the Italian merchants evacuated. The trade routes reconfigured. Acre faded into a minor port. Its destiny was tied to a larger political project, and when that collapsed, the city did too. These events also triggered devastating demographic changes. The movement of armies, the displacement of populations, the spread of illness along newly busy routes. It had profound, often terrible, consequences for urban life. The concentration of people in crusader camps, the constant movement along trade corridors, it created pathways for contagion. With lasting impacts on the size and health of communities across continents, recovery from such losses could take generations. It altered the labor force. It altered the very social fabric of cities. It makes you reflect on our own time. How do contemporary geopolitical shifts function as modern macro events? The opening of the Suez Canal in the 19th century, it instantly made London and Marseille closer to Mumbai. It sidelined older overland routes. The fall of the Berlin Wall reconfigured the economic map of Europe overnight. Today, the opening of new Arctic shipping lanes or major conflicts that close strategic straits, these are the same forces in a modern guise. They don't just change politics, they silently decide which ports will thrive in the coming century and which will be left with idle cranes. The cities of the future are being shaped right now by these colossal, often distant tremors. A city's wealth was its people. The 20th factor was demographic resilience. After the Black Death, the silence in a marketplace wasn't just eerie. It was fatal. The loss of life was staggering. It reshaped everything. For the cities left behind, recovery wasn't about rebuilding walls. It was about repopulating them. In a world where human labor was the engine of everything, population wasn't just a statistic. It was the primary form of capital. A growing city had momentum. A shrinking one was entering a spiral. Historical studies of parish records show a harsh reality. Medieval cities were what demographers call urban graveyards. In normal times, deaths often outnumbered births. Crowded living conditions, contaminated water, the risk of illness, these made urban life precarious. High infant mortality was the norm. A city could not naturally sustain itself. It needed a constant influx of new people just to stand still. To grow, it needed a flood. So the great demographic race was won by pull factors. What could a city offer to draw people from the countryside? The most powerful offer was freedom. Across Germany and Northern Europe, a legal principle took hold. Stadtluft macht frei. City air makes you free. A serf who fled his lord's land and lived inside a chartered city for a year and a day became a free person. He could not be forcibly returned. This promise was a magnet. It turned cities into engines of social mobility. Beyond freedom, there was opportunity. A city granted burgher rights to those who could pay a fee and swear an oath. This status came with benefits: the right to trade freely, the right to have disputes heard in merchant-friendly courts. Protection under the city's militia. For a skilled craftsman, this was an invitation to build a life on his own terms. Religious sanctuary played a role too. Cities known for tolerance could attract communities fleeing persecution. This brought not just people, but often specific, valuable skills. The aftermath of the Black Death presented a paradox. The loss was catastrophic, a shared trauma. Yet for the survivors there was a sudden shift. With far fewer people competing for resources, wages for skilled laborers soared. Per capita wealth could increase. A master mason might command a price he could never have imagined before. But this silver lining had a dark cloud. The transmission of skills was violently disrupted. A master craftsman might die before teaching his most complex techniques. Whole workshops vanished, taking specialized knowledge with them. The web of mentorship and guild training was torn. Recovery meant not just finding new hands, but painfully relearning lost arts. Cities with strong guild structures and written ordinances had a better chance. They could preserve at least the blueprint of their crafts. London is the prime example of relentless pull. Even with the plague's visits, London kept growing throughout the late Middle Ages. It didn't grow from Londoners having large families. It grew because it was a sink, constantly pulling in young men and women from across England, from Yorkshire, from Norfolk, from the West Country. They came to be apprentices, to work on the docks, to serve in wealthy households. This endless renewal provided a labor force. It provided new consumers. It provided a constant churn of energy and ideas. Contrast this with a city like Winchester. Once a major royal center, it was hit hard by plague and shifting economic currents. It failed to offer the same compelling pull as London. Its population stagnated, then declined. Without fresh people, its markets shrank, its crafts decayed. Its political importance faded, a lesson in demographic stagnation. It makes you reflect on our own era. How do modern cities compete for human capital today? The offers are strikingly similar, though the language has changed. Instead of freedom from serfdom, cities advertise personal freedom, vibrant culture, career mobility. They invest in quality of life parks, transit, schools to attract talented families. They create special visa schemes for skilled immigrants. They market themselves as hubs of innovation and tolerance. The goal is identical: to win the demographic race, to ensure a constant influx of the most valuable resource, capable, ambitious people. And all these people, gathered in one place, created a new kind of problem. A problem of collective memory. How do you preserve what the community knows? How do you pass it on, not just from master to apprentice, but across generations? The answer lay in the slow accumulation of shared knowledge. It lay in the library, the university, the guild archive. The master shipwright's hands held a library. A library no parchment could ever contain. That was the 21st factor: education, the accumulation of practical knowledge. Before patents, before textbooks, a city's most valuable asset wasn't in its treasury. It was in the minds of its people, in their muscle memory, the ability to do something but also to understand why it worked, and then to teach it, to pass it on. That created a durable advantage, a form of living capital, incredibly difficult to steal, incredibly difficult to replicate. This was the ecosystem of know-how. It thrived in Venetian shipyards, it thrived in Florentine counting houses, and its most powerful engine was the guild apprenticeship system, a multi-year journey. From ignorance to mastery, tightly controlled, a young boy would be bound to a master. For years, he wouldn't just run errands, he would absorb a world. A world of tacit knowledge: how to judge raw wool by its feel, by its smell, how to mix a glaze for pottery so it would fire true every time, how to read the subtle signs in a piece of timber. To predict its strength, this knowledge wasn't written in manuals. It was passed through observation, through correction, through shared practice, and by regulating this flow, a guild ensured the city's reputation. For Flemish cloth, for Nuremberg metalwork, it remained unchallenged. It created a monopoly on skill. Beyond the workshop, complexity drove innovation. The chaos of long-distance commerce demanded new clarity. From that pressure emerged double-entry bookkeeping, first documented in Florentine ledgers. 13th century, the simple, revolutionary idea was this: every transaction has two equal sides, a debit and a credit. It created a closed system. A self-balancing map of an entire financial world. A merchant could see, at a glance, his true profit, his outstanding debts, his assets. This wasn't just accounting. It was a cognitive tool. It allowed for better planning, clearer partnerships, greater trust between investors who could now audit the books. It turned commercial intuition into a measurable science. Parallel to this, another form of practical knowledge was being charted: the map of the world itself. Port cities became living repositories, repositories of navigational lore. Pilots and captains carried mental charts, charts of currents, seasonal winds, hidden reefs, safe anchorages. This information was a state secret. In places like Majorca, this oral knowledge was gradually codified into something magnificent: the Catalan Atlas, 14th century, a masterpiece. It synthesized sailors' reports, Arab geography, travelers' tales into a breathtaking visual guide to the known world. Majorca didn't just use maps, It became a center for producing knowledge as a commodity. These luxurious atlases were sold to kings and princes, cementing the island's role as a crossroads of information. Then there were the formal universities, often focused on theology and law, but they became indirect magnets for economic energy. The University of Bologna, drawing scholars to debate Roman law. Salerno, famous for medical studies, they attracted more than students. They attracted wealthy patrons, scribes, booksellers, landlords. They created a stable, educated class. A class that could serve as notaries, as diplomats, as administrators for merchant princes. The presence of a university signaled a city's commitment to learning. To debate, qualities that also benefited commercial innovation. This slow accumulation created cycles, self-reinforcing cycles. A city known for fine glassmaking, like Venice, would attract the best glassmakers. They would collaborate, they would compete, they would push the craft further. Their presence would attract suppliers of high-quality sand and alkali, which would attract toolmakers who understood the glassmakers' needs. The ecosystem would deepen, making it almost impossible for a new city to catch up. The knowledge was in the air, in the workshops, in the daily conversations of the market. Protecting this capital was a constant struggle, a quiet struggle. Guilds enforced strict oaths of secrecy. Craftsmen might deliberately omit a key step when describing their process to an outsider. Maps would include deliberate errors. To mislead rivals, the knowledge that gave a city its edge was guarded not by walls but by tradition, by subtle deception. It makes you think about today. About our knowledge economy. What are our modern guilds, our modern atlases? Perhaps it's the research labs of tech firms, the proprietary algorithms of financial institutions, the intense training pipelines of specialized industries. The principle remains: cities and regions that become centers for generating valuable know-how. For refining it, for transmitting it, they build a moat that is incredibly difficult to cross. They don't just make things, they master the art of understanding itself. But this hard-won understanding, this collective wisdom of a city, it faced its ultimate test not from a rival but from a changing world. When the winds of commerce shifted, could a city's deep knowledge adapt? Or would it become a monument to a forgotten craft? The sketch was treason. It was drawn in lamplight. The 22nd factor covered espionage, sabotage, economic warfare. Underneath the public treaties, the market tolls, there was this other conflict, a silent one, a brutal one. It was a game played in shadows, where a single stolen secret could be worth a fleet of ships. So cities, merchant leagues, they didn't just compete. They waged clandestine wars to cripple a rival, to steal their future outright. This was commerce by other means. You'd read a chronicle from Genoa, and it might just note a mysterious fire in a Pisan shipyard. A Venetian diplomatic letter would hint at favorable information, acquired from a source in Cairo. These weren't accidents, they weren't luck, they were operations calculated. The goal was always the same: to tilt the economic landscape by any means necessary. The methods varied, and they were brutally effective. Industrial espionage went after the most guarded knowledge. The classic story is Venice and silk. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire held a monopoly on silk production in Christendom. The process was a state secret, but Venetian merchants, they wanted to control that trade from start to finish. So they orchestrated this long-term operation. They allegedly bribed officials. They smuggled out silkworm eggs. They convinced skilled weavers to leave Constantinople for the lagoons. Maybe they compelled them. By the 12th century, Venice had its own silk industry. It broke the monopoly, not through fair trade, through systematic theft. The theft of intellectual property, that pattern repeated. A city known for superior armor might find its master smiths getting offers, irresistible sums to relocate. A center of mapmaking would guard its portolan charts like gold reserves. Sabotage was more direct. Damaging a rival's infrastructure could be a crippling blow. Contaminating a cargo of wool with pests could ruin its value for years, tarnish a reputation, but the most feared tactic was arson in a warehouse district. A shipyard, a single night's work could destroy capital it took a generation to accumulate. Given the dense wooden construction of medieval ports, fire was a weapon. A weapon of mass economic destruction. Then there was information warfare. Spreading false rumors was cheap, powerful. A Hanseatic merchant might let slip in a crowded Antwerp tavern that a pirate fleet was massing off Norway. The goal was to scare competitors, delay their Baltic voyages, make insurance premiums soar for everyone but his own syndicate. He could manipulate markets, create artificial scarcity. A forged letter, purportedly from a king declaring an embargo, could send prices spiraling before the truth caught up. When covert action wasn't enough, cities turned to licensed piracy. Letters of marque, these were official documents from a government. They authorized a private ship to attack and capture the vessels of a rival state. It was privatized naval warfare. A Genoa's captain with such a letter could legally prey on Venetian shipping, turn his merchant vessel into a predator. The profits from captured cargo were split between the captain and the issuing government. It blurred the line between commerce and conflict, turned the open sea into a perpetual hunting ground. Economic blockades were a weapon of mass coercion. The Hanseatic League wielded this with devastating effect. If a prince or a city like Novgorod threatened Hanseatic privileges, the response was collective. Merciless, the League would declare a trade embargo. All member cities would cease all commerce with the target. No grain shipped in, no cloth or salt sold. The target's economy would begin to strangle. Faced with internal unrest, financial collapse, they would usually capitulate, restore the Hanse's favored status. It was a stark demonstration. In a networked world, economic isolation could be more fearsome than any siege army. Sometimes, these commercial rivalries ignited full-scale wars. Political wars, the War of the Sicilian Vespers in the late 13th century, is a textbook case. On the surface, it was a dynastic struggle over Sicily. But fueling it was the commercial rivalry between Genoa and Pisa. Both wanted dominance over the trade routes through the central Mediterranean. Control of Sicily was the key. So their merchant elites funded factions, supplied warships, turned a succession dispute into a decades-long proxy war. The battlefield was just an extension of the marketplace. The pursuit of profit could topple kingdoms. It makes you reflect on our own era. How does modern corporate espionage, the theft of trade secrets through cyber intrusion, reflect this ancient pattern? How do state-sponsored cyber attacks on a competitor's energy grid function as the digital equivalent of burning a rival's warehouse? The tools have evolved. From bribes and smuggled silkworms to malware and insider threats, but the objective is unchanged: to gain an economic advantage through covert, deniable aggression. To win not by building a better product, but by disabling your competitor's ability to build at all. Surviving in that environment required more than sharp elbows. More than hidden knives, it demanded something public, something glorious. A city needed a story about itself, a story so compelling that allies would believe it. And rivals would fear it. That scarlet cloak, it wasn't just fabric, it was a story. The 23rd factor was cultural prestige, a kind of branding. Before mass media, a city's name could become a synonym for excellence. A noble in France wouldn't just want red cloth, he'd demand scarlet of Venice. That phrase meant a specific dye, a specific weave. It was a guarantee of status. It commanded a premium price. Not because it was objectively better, but because everyone agreed it was. That was the power of reputation, economic armor. A city that cultivated this kind of capital didn't just sell goods, it sold an identity, it sold trust. And that trust let it weather competition that would break a lesser place. So how do you build a brand in a world without logos, without ad campaigns? You build it with stone and ritual. Architectural marvels were the ultimate billboards. The soaring cathedral of a trading city wasn't just for prayer. It was a statement of wealth and divine favor, visible for miles. A merchant arriving by sea would see the skyline of Bruges or Cologne, a forest of guild halls, belfries, and know he was entering a place of consequence. These structures projected power, they projected stability, they told a visitor this city is permanent, it's prosperous, it's capable of grand things. And civic rituals reinforced this daily. The lavish procession for a patron saint, with every guild marching in its finest robes, displaying its wares. That was a living advertisement. It showcased order, it showcased unity, it showcased surplus wealth, a performance of reliability for an audience of foreign merchants. But the real engine of the brand was the guild. Enforcing quality was their sacred duty. In Florence, the Art della Lana, the Wool Guild, had inspectors. Inspectors who could confiscate substandard cloth and burn it publicly. This wasn't just about punishing a cheat. It was about protecting the city's most valuable asset, its reputation for flawless woolens. A buyer in London could order Pani di Fion sight unseen, confident in the quality. That reliability, built over decades, over centuries, turned into an unshakable market position. The product's name and the city's name became the same thing. Some names transcended into legend. Damascus steel, that phrase evoked a near mythical metal. The distinctive watery pattern, the legendary sharpness, the technique was a closely guarded secret, originating from Indian wood steel, perfected in Syrian forges. Its reputation was so powerful that blades were prized across continents, often imitated but never truly duplicated. Toledo blades from Spain carried a similar aura. They were more than weapons, they were artifacts of supreme craftsmanship. The city's name on the tang was a certificate, a promise of superior performance. This prestige created a monopoly of desire, and the marketing happened through the merchant networks themselves. A Venetian spice trader didn't just sell pepper. He sold the story of the Venetian fleet, the security of the Venetian warehouse, the legacy of Venetian taste. He was a brand ambassador. The dense correspondence between merchants spread these reputations like gossip, reinforcing the idea that certain cities were the sole sources for the finest versions of anything. Yet this prestige was fragile. It was a covenant with the customer. Break it and the fall was swift. If guilds became corrupt, if quality control lapsed, if cheaper imitations flooded the market and the city didn't act, the brand eroded. The story of English broadcloth eventually overtaking Flemish cloth is partly that, quality catching up and then surpassing. The Flemish cities, burdened by internal strife, by rigid guild structures, sometimes failed to innovate. Their once unassailable brand faced a formidable challenger, and a brand could also be stolen. Other cities might produce goods and falsely label them as the premium product, diluting the original's value, confusing the market. Protecting the brand required constant vigilance. The tradition is alive. Cologne water, eau de Cologne, though an 18th century creation, is a direct descendant of this logic. The name of the city is the name of the product. It carries a whiff of place, a specific origin story that implies quality. We see it today in champagne from France, Parmesan cheese from Parma, Swiss watches. The geographic indicator is a legal fortress built around that medieval idea, place-based excellence. It makes you wonder, how does a modern city or region build its brand now? Is it through a famous skyline, a film festival, a reputation for tech innovation, or clean governance? The tools are different: global media, tourism campaigns, digital presence, but the goal is the same: to create a story about a place, a story that attracts talent, investment, visitors. To make a name mean something more than a spot on a map, a strong brand was a final layer of defense. When trade routes shifted, when new competitors arose, a city with a legendary name could hold on. It could hold on to a loyal, high-end market long after its geographic advantages had faded. But even the strongest brand eventually faces a question. What happens when the world finds a completely new way of doing things, when the very foundations of how value is created begin to tremble? The river's path was a promise. Until it wasn't. The 24th factor was environmental change, resource depletion. A city's success was always a negotiation with the natural world. And that world was never static. You see it in the silting of the river's Win. For centuries, that waterway was the lifeline for Bruges. It let seagoing ships reach its inland quays. But over generations, sediment carried by the tides began to clog the channel. The city fought back, they dredged, they dug, and yet the land was reclaiming itself. By the 15th century, the Zwin wasn't navigable for large ships anymore. Bruges, this great warehouse of northern Europe, was suddenly landlocked. Its economic heart was strangled by mud. Geography gave the gift, and then a gradual, natural process took it away. That was the rule, not the exception. Medieval cities existed in a dynamic ecosystem, a fragile one. Long-term shifts, climatic, ecological. They could quietly undermine the very foundations of prosperity. The medieval warm period, that stretch of mild temperatures from the 10th to the 13th centuries, it wasn't just a weather note, it was an economic engine. It let Norse settlers farm in Greenland, it expanded vineyards in England, it made mountain passes accessible for longer seasons. Then the climate shifted toward the Little Ice Age. And those advantages reversed. Growing seasons shortened, harvests failed. The Norse settlements in Greenland, their marginal agriculture pushed past its limit, they vanished. A change in average temperature of just a degree or two that could rewrite a community's destiny. The most common challenge was silt. Rivers aren't static lines on a map. They're living systems that deposit sediment. A thriving port needed constant, expensive maintenance to keep its harbor deep. Ravenna, once a great Roman port on the Adriatic. It was slowly abandoned by the sea as the Po River delta expanded. Its magnificent buildings were left stranded in a swamp. Cities that could afford the endless engineering battle, like Venice dredging its lagoon, they survived. Those that couldn't, they watched their wharves become meadows. Resource depletion was slower, more insidious. Mining and metalworking centers consumed wood voraciously. For fuel, for construction, the forests around them receded. As timber had to be hauled from farther away, the cost of production soared. A smelting town that grew rich on local ore and local charcoal could find its whole business model unraveling. The hills around it stripped bare. The very industry that built the wealth was destroying the resource that made it possible. Rivers could be fickle allies too. Changing their courses over time, a bustling river port with its warehouses and cranes might wake up one season to find the main channel had shifted a mile away. The busy quay was now a quiet backwater, and a rival settlement downstream suddenly found itself on the new trade route. Success built on a riverbank was always provisional, subject to the water's whim. So how did cities respond? Adaptation was a test of flexibility and capital. Some embarked on heroic engineering. They dug canals to bypass silted river mouths, to reconnect to shifted channels. But these projects were staggeringly expensive. They required a level of collective will and investment that only the most unified cities could muster. Or the most desperate, others tried economic reinvention. If the port died, maybe the city could become a center of finance or luxury craft, relying on overland routes. That shift was profoundly difficult. It meant abandoning the core identity that had defined the place for generations. There's a classic example of failure to adapt. Earlier but still a cautionary tale, the Maya cities. Research suggests intensive agriculture, coupled with prolonged drought, degraded the land's capacity to support large urban populations. The cities weren't conquered by an outside army, they were gradually abandoned. The environment that sustained them could no longer do it, the infrastructure remained. But the foundation had crumbled. It makes you consider our own century. Modern coastal cities, from Miami to Shanghai, they're grappling with a contemporary version of harbor silting. The challenge is sea level rise, the massive investments in seawalls, pumping systems, land elevation. Those are the modern equivalents of dredging the Zwin. Attempts to hold back a natural process that, in the long term, may prove just as relentless. The question for any city, in any era, stays the same. When the environment changes, can you change with it? Adaptation isn't just about building a higher wall. It's about the courage to reinvent what your city is for. A guild charter was a fortress. It protected quality, it protected wages, it protected a way of life. But a fortress can also be a prison. That's the 25th factor, institutional rigidity, the failure to adapt, the very structures that built a city's greatness, the guilds, the councils, the charters they could harden. They'd lock a city into an economic model the world had already moved past. Success creates a path, and then there's this force, this powerful, often unconscious force, that keeps everyone walking that same path. Even as it leads toward a cliff, economists have a term for it: path dependency. Past choices limit future ones. The cost of change feels too high. The benefits of the old way are too familiar. So a city or a league chooses managed decline over disruptive reinvention. You see it in the Hanseatic League's later centuries. Its power was built on a specific system. A network of independent cities united by mutual interest controlling the Baltic and North Sea trade, and it worked for generations, but then the map changed. Powerful nation-states rose: England, Muscovy. They wanted direct control of their own commerce. New Atlantic routes began to draw economic gravity away from the Baltic. And the Hanse's response was often to double down, to reassert its old privileges, to try and enforce its traditional monopolies through embargo, through diplomacy. It was a conservative strategy, defending a fading status quo. The League's decentralized structure, once its great strength, made coordinated reform incredibly difficult. Each member city had its own vested interests to protect. Reaching a consensus for radical change was nearly impossible. So while Atlantic-facing ports in Portugal, the Netherlands, England, they invested in new ship designs, in global ventures, many Hanseatic cities clung to the cog. To the familiar Baltic cycle, they were protecting a legacy, but in doing so, they missed the future. On the water, technological pride could become a trap. The Mediterranean galley was a masterpiece, fast, maneuverable, perfect for the short hops and summer campaigns of that inland sea. The Italian maritime republics were the undisputed masters of galley construction and warfare. So when the full-rigged, ocean-going carrack emerged, and later the galleon ships capable of carrying vast cargoes across the open Atlantic, there was resistance. A deep cultural attachment to the galley slowed adoption. The skills, the shipyards were built around it. Why abandon the vessel that made us great? The new ships were different. They required new knowledge, new port facilities, a new kind of seamanship. For a time, cities like Genoa and Venice tried to have it both ways. Using galleys for Mediterranean luxury runs and hiring foreign ships for Atlantic voyages. That hesitation ceded the initiative. It allowed newcomers with no legacy systems to protect, to master the new technology. To dominate the new routes. The story of the Flemish cloth towns is a textbook study. Bruges, Ghent, Ypres, their wealth was the finest woolen cloth in Europe. Their guilds controlled every step with an iron grip. They enforced quality, but they also enforced strict limits on production methods, on workforce size, on innovation. When English clothmakers began producing a good, cheaper broadcloth, The Flemish response was often protectionism, lobbying for import bans, clinging to their high-end niche. But they struggled to move up the value chain further, to create something even more luxurious, more irreplaceable. Their powerful guilds, designed to protect their members' privileges, became barriers to the very adaptation needed to survive. They were protecting the castle while the kingdom changed around them. Contrast this with a city that managed a pivot, Florence, in the 14th and 15th centuries. Its initial wealth was built on the art della lana, the wool guild, processing English wool into fine cloth. But when economic conditions squeezed that trade, Florentine elites didn't just cling to the looms. They leveraged their accumulated capital, their commercial networks. They moved into banking, became financiers to popes and kings, and they plowed immense profits into art and architecture, making Florence a cultural beacon that attracted talent and prestige for centuries. They transformed their city from an industrial center into a financial and artistic capital. That required flexible institutions and a merchant class willing to reinvent its own identity. The paralysis often came from a legitimate fear, the fear of social unrest. Changing an economic model meant displacing skilled workers, undermining powerful families, rewriting the social contract. A city council facing the choice between a risky new future and the familiar, if declining present, often chose the present. Keeping the peace today felt more urgent than securing prosperity for a generation hence. The guildsman who saw a new machine as a threat to his livelihood wasn't wrong. He was fighting for his place in the world, but when every city protected its guildsmen, the one that found a way to navigate that change, or the new city with no guilds at all, would eventually win. It makes you reflect on our own time. You can see similar patterns in modern industries in cities, the struggle of a manufacturing hub to transition to a knowledge economy. The reluctance of a legacy corporation to abandon a profitable but aging technology for a disruptive new one. The political difficulty of reforming pension systems, tax codes designed for a different era. The dilemma is identical. How do you honor the institutions and social structures that built your success without letting them become the anchors that drag you down? The decline from institutional rigidity is rarely a dramatic collapse. It's a slow leak, a gradual dimming. It's the quiet realization, years later, that the rivals who surged ahead were not necessarily smarter or richer. They were simply less burdened by their own glorious past. A ledger from Lisbon, 1500. It's just cargo lists, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, but the route is different. It doesn't name Alexandria or Beirut, it names Calicut, Goa. This ship went south around the Cape of Good Hope, straight to where the spices grew. That page of accounts, it's the end of something. An old way of life. The 26th factor was competing hubs, new routes. No city existed alone, not even with perfect laws or a deep harbor. It was tied to a web. And when that web changed from politics, from technology, from someone's daring, the center would move, sometimes slow like a tide, sometimes sudden like a rope snapping. The big pivot was Constantinople, 1453. The Ottomans took it. For centuries, that city was the choke point, the bottleneck. Almost all luxury trade from Asia to Europe went through there. Its fall sent a shock through Venice, through Genoa. The new rulers weren't against trade. They'd become a power themselves, but it was a change, a renegotiation. More than that, it showed a vulnerability. Europe's access to spices and silks depended on middlemen, on the Mamluks in Egypt, now on the Ottomans in Constantinople. That dependency was a weakness, a strategic one. It created an incentive, a powerful, urgent need to find another way. The Portuguese answer wasn't to fight for the old route. It was to make a new one. Decades of exploration down Africa's coast, Prince Henry, captains like Dyers, like da Gama. It ended with a sea lane straight to India. Route diversification on a continental scale. It didn't tweak the map, it redrew it. Lisbon was just a modest Atlantic port. Then it became the end of a global highway. Ships came in full of pepper. Their holds were worth more than entire Mediterranean fleets. The old middlemen, the Venetians in Alexandria, the Arab traders in the Red Sea, they were bypassed. Their strategic value just evaporated. The wealth didn't stop, it just went somewhere else. This shows a brutal rule. New hubs often rose because they had fewer constraints. Lisbon wasn't held back by Bruges's guild systems or Italian city-state politics. It was a centralized kingdom. The crown ran the trade as a state monopoly. The Casa d'India managed everything. That lack of entrenched interests meant they could move fast. They could focus. They built a new port for a new kind of ship. They organized armadas around a single commercial goal. They were building a system from scratch, made for the new reality. The old hubs were trying to adapt a system made for a world that was gone. The impact was rarely a sudden collapse. It was a slow draining. Take Venice in the 16th century. It was still glorious, still wealthy, a city of incredible art. But its core reason for being, its monopoly on the spice trade, was leaking away year by year, ship by ship. Its political power waned next to the new Atlantic kingdoms. The money was still there, but the growth, the dynamism, the future that was sailing west. You see this cycle in the north too. The Zwin River silted up. It choked Bruges. The economic energy of the Low Countries shifted. It moved to Antwerp on the deeper Scheldt River. Antwerp embraced a more open, liberal model. It became the great free market of 16th century Europe, where German metals, English cloth, Portuguese spices, and Spanish silver all met. For a while, it was the new center. But its success made it a target. Political and religious conflict came, the Spanish siege, the closure of the Scheldt. It was stifled, and the energy moved again. North to Amsterdam. Amsterdam learned from Antwerp's model but added its own things, a powerful stock exchange, the world's first central bank. It built an empire less on controlling goods and more on controlling finance. Controlling information. Each hub rose by exploiting a new opportunity or a rival's weakness, and each faced its own challenger in time. That raises a question for now. For our globalized world, our modern trade networks so connected, so resilient, that bypassing a major hub is impossible. Maybe not impossible, but the nature of displacement has changed. Today it's less about one new sea route. It's more about manufacturing shifting from one region to another, the rise of container shipping and mega ports in Asia altering the flow. Or digital platforms creating new financial hubs without a physical port at all. The displacement is still there, it's just layered over a more complex system. A major port might not be abandoned, but it can become secondary, its cranes idle, while the supercontainer ships sail for deeper waters somewhere else. This relentless dance of rise and fall, it brings us to the final synthesis. We've traced the ingredients: geography, politics, money, knowledge, human adaptability. That alignment was never guaranteed. It was this fleeting harmony between a place and its moment. We've seen the whole web. The geographic luck of a river bend, the crushing weight of institutional inertia, all of it writing a city's destiny. Venice, Bruges, Constantinople, their story teaches a clear lesson. Becoming a trade giant was never one single, spectacular advantage. It was a dynamic alignment and a precarious one. A city needed the right location, but then it needed the political wisdom to build trust. It needed military power to create safety, the social cohesion to foster cooperation, an innovative spirit to master new ships, new laws, new ways to move value, and it needed that relentless flexibility to adapt whenever one of those pillars began to shift. Their golden ages weren't accidents, they were achievements, built stone by stone, contract by contract, voyage by voyage, and their declines remind us of something. In economics, like in ecology, there are no permanent peaks. There are adaptive valleys, resilient plateaus, a city that stopped listening to the changing winds, a new ship design from Portugal, silt filling its harbor, a rival offering better terms. That city would begin a long, slow fade. Its wealth might linger in its palaces, but its vitality would drain away. The forces that shaped their world aren't relics. They're still at work today, just wearing different clothes. The search for efficiency now drives global supply chains. The flow of information that once moved by courier now moves at light speed through cables. That eternal tension between security and openness now defines debates over data, immigration, trade. Our modern megacities, our digital marketplaces, they're playing out the same ancient drama but on a planetary scale. So as a closing thought, the next great trade hub might not be on a coast or a river. It might be a server farm in Nevada humming with data. It might be a virtual space, a metaverse where digital assets are the new spice. But no matter how futuristic it seems, it will still be subject to those same fundamental human principles. It will need access to critical resources, whether that's rare earth minerals or bandwidth. It will need to cultivate trust through transparent algorithms, enforceable digital contracts, and above all, it will need the capacity to adapt, to reinvent itself before the world moves on. The geography has changed, but the game remains the same.